New York City, a place where success and failure walk hand in hand on the same sidewalks. If these stories move you, show your support with a like, subscribe to the channel and turn on the bell. It's wonderful to have you here. Jackson Reed, 42, was a self-made millionaire, known for building a tech empire from his college dorm room. He dressed sharp, drove a sleek black Tesla, and spoke with the confidence of someone used to getting what he wanted. But over time, his success had inflated his ego. To him, everything was either a transaction or a joke, especially when it came to people he deemed below his level. One rainy Wednesday afternoon, Jackson walked into a small, cozy Italian restaurant in Brooklyn called Rena's Table. He wasn't used to such humble places, but his assistant had forgotten to book his lunch at his usual five-star venue. Annoyed, but hungry, he sat down. The waitress approached with a warm smile. "Good afternoon, sir. My name is Carla. Would you like to start with something to drink?" Jackson immediately noticed her accent, thick, melodic, and unmistakably Latin. Probably from Puerto Rico or the Dominican Republic, he thought. But instead of appreciating her effort to speak English politely and clearly, he chuckled under his breath. "I'll have a sparkling water," he said, mimicking her accent mockingly. "And maybe a dictionary." Carla blinked. She had dealt with rude customers before, but this one hit differently. The jab was personal. Still, she kept her composure and smiled. "Coming right up," she replied gently, her eyes revealing a quiet strength. As Carla walked away, Jackson leaned back in his chair and smirked, pulling out his phone and scrolling through emails. To him, it was just another moment of superiority. But what he didn't know was that this encounter would be the start of one of the most humbling experiences of his life. He ordered his food, lasagna and a side of bruschetta, but didn't even bother to say thank you when Carla served it. Throughout the meal, he made occasional snide remarks, even joking to a man on the phone. "This place is so local, even the waitresses come with subtitles." Other diners nearby noticed. Some looked away uncomfortably. Others whispered. Carla remained calm, professional and gracious through it all. As he asked for the check, he glanced at Carla one last time and smirked. "Hope your boss doesn't dock your pay for speaking too foreign." He laughed at his own comment, placed his platinum card on the table, and waited. Carla simply smiled again. "Actually, sir, the boss won't be docking anything." Jackson raised an eyebrow. "Why's that?" Carla picked up his card with grace, leaned in slightly and said softly, "Because I am the boss." Jackson froze. "Welcome to my restaurant," she added, walking away to process the payment. He sat in stunned silence, looking around the beautifully decorated room he had barely noticed. Photos of Carla with celebrity guests adorned the walls. A local award from the Brooklyn Business Council hung behind the counter. Entrepreneur of the Year, Carla Rosario. The food, the staff, the ambiance, everything he had taken for granted, it was hers. His smirk faded, replaced by a quiet shame that started to burn in his chest. This was just the beginning. The walk back to his car felt heavier than usual. For the first time in a long time, Jackson Reed felt small. Inside his Tesla, he replayed Carla's words in his mind over and over. "Because I am the boss." How could he, a millionaire, a keynote speaker, a business mentor, have been so blind, so arrogant? Still, Jackson's pride was too big to admit his fault right away. Instead of apologizing, he told himself, "She must be one of those women who inherited money. Or maybe she's just the face of the business, not the brain." But something deeper inside gnawed at him, a discomfort he couldn't shake. That evening, back in his high-rise apartment overlooking Manhattan, he looked up Rena's Table. What he found humbled him further. Carla Rosario, born in San Juan, Puerto Rico, immigrated alone to the US at age 18, started as a dishwasher, took night classes to learn English, opened her first food cart at 26, saved for 10 years to open Rena's Table, named after her late grandmother. The restaurant had been featured in The New Yorker, Forbes, and even a Netflix food documentary about immigrant entrepreneurs. Suddenly, Jackson's insults weren't just rude, they were ignorant and deeply unfair. The next day, haunted by guilt, Jackson returned to the restaurant unannounced. Carla saw him walk in from behind the counter. Her posture stayed composed, but her smile faded slightly. She wasn't surprised. Entitled men often returned, but rarely to apologize. He approached her with more humility in his steps. "Carla," he said, "I wanted to—" "Would you like a table, sir?" she interrupted with professional distance. Jackson hesitated. "Actually, I came to apologize." She looked at him, not angry, but calm and steady. "Apologize for what, exactly?" Jackson swallowed hard. This wasn't a boardroom. There were no shareholders to impress, no assistants to deflect blame. "For what I said yesterday," he replied, "for mocking your accent, for acting like you were less than me." He looked down for a moment, then added, "You built something amazing here, and I didn't see it because I was too arrogant to look." Carla studied his face. She had heard apologies before, some genuine, some forced. But this time she saw something she didn't expect from him: shame and sincerity. "I appreciate that," she said simply. Jackson nodded. "Can I buy you a coffee? Or maybe just listen to your story? I think I have a lot to learn." For the first time since they met, Carla gave him a real smile. "I don't do pity meetings. But if you're serious, there's a local small business panel I'm speaking on this weekend. Come by. You might hear more than just my story." Jackson agreed. "I'll be there." New bonds, new awareness. Over the next few days, Jackson began reflecting on more than just Carla. He realized how often he had dismissed, talked over, or minimized people with accents, unfamiliar backgrounds, or less polished appearances. It wasn't just Carla he owed an apology. It was a whole world he'd blocked out behind his own ego. At the panel event, he listened intently as Carla shared her journey, how her grandmother taught her to cook, how she faced racist customers, how she failed twice before succeeding. Her voice, once a target of mockery, now echoed with inspiration and power as she ended her speech with the phrase, "Never let someone else's ignorance define your value." Jackson stood and applauded, not out of guilt, but out of admiration. He wasn't just a millionaire anymore. He was a man beginning to grow. The auditorium emptied slowly after the panel event, but Jackson remained seated, staring at the stage where Carla had just spoken. He felt a deep shift stirring inside him, something beyond shame or guilt. It was the start of a transformation. He had built his life on performance, power, and profit, but for the first time, he felt the weight of something more meaningful: respect, earned, not bought. After the event, Carla approached him. "You stayed until the end," she said. "I needed to," Jackson replied. "That story, it reminded me of everything I forgot on my way up." Carla nodded thoughtfully. "Climbing fast makes people forget how they started." Then, after a brief pause, she added, "You know, my grandmother used to say, you can taste a person's soul in the way they cook or speak. I think you've got some seasoning to work on, Mr. Reed." Jackson laughed genuinely this time. "I think I'm ready to start." A bold invitation. A week later, Carla received an unexpected email from Jackson's office. Subject: Business with Soul. A new venture proposal. Message: I'd like to meet. Not for coffee, for partnership. I want to invest in something real, something with heart, and I want to start by learning from you. Name the time and place. She debated for hours whether to accept. She didn't need his money. Her restaurant was thriving. But maybe this wasn't about business. Maybe this was about building a bridge where there had been a wall. She replied, "Dinner at Rena's table, 7 p.m. That's the dinner." When Jackson arrived that evening, Carla greeted him, not as a waitress, not as a boss, but as a peer. They sat down at a small table near the window. No assistants, no contracts, just two people, two journeys, and a shared table. They spoke for hours. Carla told stories of her early days, washing dishes in silence, how she would practice English with old cookbooks. She described the first night she opened Rena's table and how only 3 customers showed up, one of them by accident. Jackson shared about his father's strict ways, the loneliness of his rise, and how success had slowly turned into a mask he didn't know how to remove. For the first time, Jackson wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was just present. And Carla, once mocked for her voice, was now the teacher in the room. A small act with big meaning. At the end of dinner, Carla stood up and said, "Wait here." She disappeared into the kitchen and returned with a simple framed photo. It showed Carla and her grandmother Rena in front of an old food truck, smiling with joy despite worn clothes and tired hands. A note was scrawled at the bottom in Spanish. El respeto no se exige, se gana con humildad. Respect is not demanded. It is earned with humility. She handed it to Jackson. "Take it," she said. "I think you're on the path to understanding what this means." Jackson accepted the gift with emotion in his eyes. "Thank you, Carla, for the second chance." The framed photo now sat in Jackson's office, not hidden on a shelf, but displayed front and center on his desk. Every morning as he sipped his coffee, he'd read the words, "Respect is not demanded. It is earned with humility." This wasn't just a motto now. It was a challenge, one he took seriously. A new direction. In the months following that dinner, Jackson began to reevaluate not just his attitude, but his entire company culture. He noticed things he had once ignored. The janitor who no one spoke to, the receptionist people brushed past without greeting, the engineers with brilliant minds but broken English. He initiated something called Voices at the Table, a monthly roundtable at his company where employees of all levels and backgrounds could share ideas, stories, and feedback. No titles, no hierarchy, just people being heard. At the first meeting, his assistant Maria, a shy woman from Colombia who had always avoided speaking in public, raised her hand and shared a product improvement idea that eventually saved the company over $500,000 in inefficiencies. Jackson smiled. Another accent, another treasure, growing together. Meanwhile, his bond with Carla deepened. Though their worlds were different, their values were slowly aligning. She invited him to help fund a community culinary school for immigrants, not as a vanity project, but as a real commitment. "We won't name it after you," she warned playfully, "but you'll help build it with your hands." So Jackson did. He showed up in jeans and gloves, laying tiles, organizing inventory, even learning to cook a proper sofrito from Carla herself. He fumbled, burned rice once, and nearly sliced his finger chopping onions. But he laughed and learned. He was no longer above the kitchen. He was in it. The change in him. People began to notice. Investors who once saw him as cold started describing him as humanized. Journalists who had praised his brilliance now wrote about his transformation. And Jackson started noticing something too. He was happier. Not because he made more money, but because he finally understood the power of listening, the richness in humility, and the beauty in voices that didn't sound like his own. His heart had opened, not in a dramatic movie-style epiphany, but slowly, like a flower recognizing the sun. And at the center of that growth stood Carla, a quiet moment. One evening, after a long day helping at the culinary school, they sat on a rooftop overlooking Brooklyn. Carla, sipping tea, asked softly, "Do you ever miss your old self?" Jackson looked out at the skyline, then shook his head. "I miss how easy it was to pretend I had everything figured out, but now I actually like who I'm becoming." She smiled. "Then you're further than most." They sat in silence for a while, letting the breeze carry the weight of old mistakes away. 6 months later, the grand opening of Lavau's Academy, the immigrant culinary school, was set to take place. It had started as a dream between Carla and her grandmother. Now it stood tall, colorful, and full of life, right in the heart of Brooklyn. The building buzzed with excitement. Journalists, chefs, donors, and families filled the courtyard. At the center stood a large stage with 2 chairs, one for Carla and one for the guest speaker she insisted on having, Jackson read the speech. As he stepped up to the microphone, Jackson felt something he hadn't felt in years: nervousness. Not because he feared judgment, but because he wanted to do justice to the moment. He looked at the audience, a sea of cultures, accents, ages, and began, "6 months ago, I walked into a restaurant and made a fool of myself. I mocked a woman's voice because it sounded different from mine. What I didn't realize was that her voice carried generations. Her voice built walls and painted them with flavor. Her voice fed people, comforted them, and gave them hope. That voice taught me who I really was. And today, I stand here not as a millionaire, but as a student. The crowd grew silent, moved by his vulnerability. He turned to Carla, sitting just off stage. "Carla, thank you. You didn't just change me, you made me useful." She smiled, eyes glistening, and gave him a small, encouraging nod. The surprise announcement. Then Carla took the mic. "As some of you know, this academy was born from a promise I made to my grandmother, to lift others the way she lifted me. But I never imagined I'd be joined by someone who once saw me as less." She paused, then said, "That man not only helped fund this building, he insisted on building it with his own hands. So today, it's my honor to name our scholarship program after someone who proved that change is possible when the heart is open." She turned to Jackson. "The Jackson Reed Second Chance Scholarship will support students who've faced discrimination, language barriers, or setbacks, and give them the tools to rise." Jackson stood frozen, this time in stunned gratitude. He didn't know whether to speak or cry, so he did both. Carla stepped forward and hugged him gently. "Welcome to the other side," she whispered. The crowd reacts. The crowd erupted into applause, not just for the building or the academy, but for what the moment represented: growth, forgiveness, and unexpected friendship. Cameras flashed. News outlets captured headlines like, "From arrogance to ally, tech mogul honored by immigrant chef." But for Jackson and Carla, it wasn't about headlines anymore. It was about redemption and respect. The evening ended with laughter, hugs, and food from dozens of cultures, a celebration of flavor, identity, and unity. Dishes from Colombia, Ethiopia, Vietnam, Mexico, and Puerto Rico filled long banquet tables in the courtyard of La Voz Academy. Jackson and Carla stood side by side, no longer from different worlds, but from the same mission. The days that followed, news of the academy spread quickly. Donations poured in. Volunteers signed up. Local governments reached out to replicate the model in other cities. And Jackson, he stopped being introduced as tech millionaire Jackson Reed. Now, people knew him as the man who changed. He stepped back from the spotlight, refusing interviews that focused on his wealth. "Tell Carla's story," he'd say. "She's the real headline." He spent more time at the academy than in boardrooms. He hosted workshops on entrepreneurship for students, not just the business of money, but the ethics of leadership. He taught them what he had learned the hard way, that how you treat people is more valuable than what you achieve. Carla's legacy, rewritten for Carla. This was more than a personal victory. It was proof that pain could become power, and that even insults could plant seeds of growth in the right soil. She was no longer just a restaurant owner. She was a mentor, a leader, a builder of futures. And every time she walked through the halls of La Voz Academy and saw a young immigrant student speaking broken English with pride, she smiled. Not because they sounded perfect, but because they were trying, just like she once had. One final scene. One quiet evening, months later, Jackson returned to Rena's table, now expanded with a second location. No cameras, no announcement, just him. Carla walked over, still wearing her apron, still carrying that familiar grace. "Well, look who it is," she teased. "I was hoping for a table," he said with a grin. She handed him a menu and leaned in, whispering with a wink, "Just don't make fun of my accent this time." He laughed, hands raised. "Never again." 2 years later, a soft breeze moved through the open windows of a modern classroom at La Voz Academy, where a new batch of students gathered for orientation. Among them sat teenagers, single mothers, refugees, former line cooks, and dreamers of all kinds, each carrying a story, each speaking with an accent. At the front of the room, Carla stood smiling. "Welcome," she began, her voice still proudly laced with the sounds of her Puerto Rican roots. "This place was built for people who were once told they weren't enough, but let me tell you now, You are more than enough. You are the future." The students clapped. And in the back corner, unseen by most, Jackson Reed sat quietly with a notebook in hand, still learning, still growing, still listening. He wasn't a guest speaker today. He was just another student of life, committed to becoming better. A legacy etched in action. Thanks to the Jackson Reed Second Chance Scholarship, dozens of students had already graduated and gone on to open bakeries, food trucks, and restaurants of their own, many of them proudly advertising in English and their native languages. In time, Jackson's own tech company began hiring chefs from the program to lead cultural food events, and his board of directors grew more diverse than ever before. But more importantly, Jackson became a quiet example of what was possible when a person listened, truly listened, to someone they once overlooked. Carla often told this story to her students. "Once, a man mocked my voice. Then he helped me amplify it. And together we turned ignorance into impact, because that's what real growth looks like. Not perfection, but humility, action, and the courage to change." Another story comes to an end, but many more are yet to come. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell. Thank you for watching. May the grace of God be with you.